Welcome to a demo of the BtBerryWifi iPhone app. This app allows you to use the iPhone to connect to a Raspberry Pi via Bluetooth and then to select a Wi-Fi network for that Raspberry Pi. This is useful if you're running your Raspberry Pi in headless mode and you don't have access to a monitor, keyboard or mouse, and you need to change the Wi-Fi network on your Pi. I have two Raspberry Pi for this demo. A Pi 4 in a typical enclosure, and a Pi 3B Plus, which is used in a guitar pedal. Both have been loaded with the necessary Python program that interfaces with the BtBerryWifi iPhone app. This Python program can be installed on the Raspberry Pi from my website. So let's launch the BtBerryWifi app. Click on its icon. This is the screen where you select the Raspberry Pi you want, if you have more than one loaded with the Python code, which is in the vicinity of the iPhone Bluetooth reach. Notice that different Pis may appear at different times. Here the Pi 3B, which is named loop 32, is slower than the Pi 4, which is named looped. You can also tap Rescan to refresh the list. Let's select the loop Raspberry Pi by tapping its name. You will first see a spinner icon showing that the iPhone is connecting to the Raspberry Pi. Then you will see another spinner indicating that the Raspberry Pi is detecting the access points and passing the list to the iPhone. Once the iPhone has received the list, the main List of Networks screen is displayed. From here you can select a Wi-Fi network to connect to. It's important to note that what you're seeing are the access points that the Raspberry Pi can see, and not what the iPhone sees with its own Wi-Fi radio. Since iPhones may have newer and more powerful Wi-Fi chips than your Raspberry Pi, it's quite possible that the list you see here is smaller than what your iPhone would display in its own Wi-Fi settings. So back to the screen display. You can see at the top that you selected the Raspberry Pi named Loop. Underneath you can see that the Raspberry Pi Wi-Fi radio is on. You can turn it off, we'll talk about it later. And you can see that the Raspberry Pi in this demo is currently connected to a Wi-Fi network named Bell 671. If you were to tap on the red disconnect, which is next to it, it would disconnect the Raspberry Pi from this network. I'm not going to do this now. Currently, the Your Network list is empty. You would see here any Wi-Fi network that the Raspberry Pi has stored in its own WPA supplicant file, if they are in range. The Other Network list is where we find the Wi-Fi networks that the Raspberry Pi can see, but has never connected to. The blue-gray wave icon indicates signal strength. The lock icon, if it's there, means that the network requires a password. Let's scroll the list up and connect to the last network called NKSAN by tapping on it. The screen that appears is asking for a password. Tap the password box and a keyboard appears and enter the password. Also note that the password is not encoded. In practice, this is not a big risk since Bluetooth range is limited and you're likely at a place where you are known since somebody had to give you the password. Click Connect in order to connect. A spinner icon appears while the connection is made. Now this can take up to 15 seconds. It's important to remember that all the iPhone is doing is passing the name of the network and the password to the Raspberry Pi, which will then attempt to connect. All connections are made by the Raspberry Pi, not by the iPhone. When the connection is made, you see once again the List of Networks screen. As expected, you're now connected to NKSAN. Note that the Bell 671 network is now listed in the Your Network list. This is a known network to the Raspberry Pi since it was previously connected. The fact that it's shown in the Your Network list means that it is not connected presently. Let us now reconnect to the Bell 671 network by tapping on it. Since the Raspberry Pi knows this network, the password is not resent to the Raspberry Pi. Only the name of the requested network is sent by the iPhone. The spinner icon indicates that the connection attempt is being made by the Raspberry Pi. Once connected, the List of Networks screen is displayed and Bell 671 is now connected. Notice that NKSAN network, which used to be listed in Other Network List, now appears under Your Network List. From now on, if you connect to it, its password is not going to be required and will never be sent by the iPhone to the Raspberry Pi again. Now let's connect to another network, say Bell 671-5G, from the Other Network List. And let's enter the wrong password. A screen is displayed indicating that connection failed, and you can re-enter the password. Instead, let's just go back to the previous screen by tapping the blue arrow in the top left-hand corner. Now let's connect to an open network. Solar, in the Other Network List, does not have a lock icon, so it is open. As soon as you tap it, it is sent to the Raspberry Pi and it will attempt to connect, since no password is required. However, if it fails, there's not much that can be done. Can't retry the password. You can try again, or in our case, let's just go back to the list of network screen. It is also possible to connect to networks that do not broadcast their name. That's called an SSID. Since the SSID is not broadcasted, the Raspberry Pi cannot find this network, but it's still possible to connect to such a network if you know in advance its SSID and password. Tap the last row on the screen where it says Other, Use Hidden SSID. Two text boxes appear, one for the SSID name of the network and one for the password. If it's correct, the Raspberry Pi will be able to connect. You'll be returned to the list of network and you will see that SSID as connected. If it is not, such as in our example here, a fail message is displayed and you can correct your entries or simply return to the previous screen. Now let us look at the Wi-Fi radio toggle switch. It is possible to turn off the Wi-Fi radio on the Raspberry Pi. This is often done to save battery, for example. Note that when you turn off the Wi-Fi on the Raspberry Pi, the Bluetooth is still active, so the iPhone app is still connected to the Raspberry Pi. Toggling off the Wi-Fi radio displays a simple screen informing us that the Wi-Fi radio is off, and clearly the Raspberry Pi is not connected to any Wi-Fi network. Toggling back on the radio turns on the Raspberry Pi Wi-Fi, and the iPhone requests the list of networks again. If the Raspberry Pi is slow to turn on, an empty list may be displayed. You may have to refresh the list using the blue curly arrows to see the network list again. Note that when turning on the Wi-Fi radio, the Raspberry Pi will not be connected to any network. You must select a network. Here we select Bell 671 in order to reconnect. Finally, it sometimes happens that the Raspberry Pi Bluetooth disconnects from the iPhone. If this occurs, a screen appears that informs you of this fact. Such Bluetooth glitches are usually temporary. Click OK will bring you back to the Raspberry Pi Select screen, where you can possibly rescan and reconnect to the Raspberry Pi you want. Note that the Python code loaded on the Pi is scheduled to only run 15 minutes after the Raspberry Pi is booted. This can be adjusted using a config file on the Pi. If the iPhone app is not turned on within these 15 minutes, or if it is left unattended for more than 15 minutes, the Python code on the Raspberry Pi will exit and the Bluetooth connection will be terminated, and this will result in the disconnected warning screen. Clicking OK will bring you back to the startup screen, but the Raspberry Pi will not be found until it is rebooted. This concludes the demo. The app is free. I hope you find it as useful as I have.